Can we talk about slavery?
Sure.
Okay, so if we go back to pre-enlightenment, then we're going back to slavery. What is your take on that?
So slavery is another one of these things that is universal. It's regulated and condoned in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. It's something that's condoned in the New Testament as well. Christians and Jews have practiced it, Muslims have practiced it, and even outside of these faiths, you have other cultures that have universally practiced slavery. Now, why is that? Like, slavery, to define it, is like owning another person, but really what it means is that you have the master has certain rights and the slave has certain rights. So in Islam, being a slave doesn't mean that you're like a piece of wood or like an object. Like, you have certain rights, but your master also has certain rights, and you provide labor. But why it's universal is because of war. When you have this all universal aspect of human civilization, which is war. What do you do with the losing side? The losing side, if you just let them go, then they'll just regroup and attack you again. Or, do you kill them? You just kill them all. That would also be something that a lot of civilizations did when they won wars. They just wiped out the entire population. But another thing that you can do is to use that population as labor. And that way you have, like, there's an economic benefit that you get when you win a war. And what happens is that the societies that have more people, the civilizations that have more people, are going to be stronger and stronger because there is technologically primitive. The more people you have, the more likely it is that you can win future wars and you can defend yourself against invading tribes or invading civilizations. So the civilizations or the cities or states that had more people and had more slaves are more likely to win and prevent being wiped out and basically conquered and destroyed. So this is why it's universal. All the major civilizations, they had slaves, and it became like a moral necessity. If you did not have slaves, you were going to get wiped out, because if you just lose the war, or you win a war and you release people that you've conquered for no gain, then the people that do take slaves are going to get stronger and stronger, and then they're going to wipe you out and basically destroy your entire civilization. So it became a moral necessity and a moral need. And so think about it as a weapon of war, like slavery. That labor is a type of weapon of war, in the same way that today you can't imagine a war that could take place without guns and bombs. Imagine
Right.
one side says that, well, guns are immoral, like bombs are immoral because you cause collateral damage, and this is a immoral way to do things. So we should just disregard all bombs, not use them. Any society that says that is immediately going to be wiped out, and so it's immoral to not use that weapon for the survival of your people or your race or religion. But you can imagine in the future, in the future, so there's some new technology, like some space laser technology, where you can precisely kill whoever you need to. And
Yeah,
they'll say, like, oh, wow, can you imagine 100 years ago they were using bombs? Like, what backwards people. But,
sure.
that would be a logical or a moral mistake, because you're not taking into effect the technological limitation. And slavery is in the same way. Like, for people to judge slavery as this, I'm not saying that all practices of slavery were good, because just like war is something universal, but you can have people who engage in barbarism, like the IDF, for example. They're engaging in a very barbaric, genocidal type of warfare. We can criticize that without saying that war in itself is something inherently immoral. War is something universal that every civilization has engaged in. And similarly, slavery is a universal aspect of human civilization. There can be bad aspects of it that immoral actors like engage, like in like transatlantic slavery, and they're literally killing slaves or treating them in barbaric ways. So I in no way endorse any of that. But the institution of slavery is something universal, and it's not necessarily immoral. It's sometimes a moral necessity as a weapon of war, and is needed for survival. So that, in a nutshell, is the defense of slavery.
That's I understand historical, but are you saying today that's okay? That slavery is today is okay.
Well, Islam doesn't require slavery. Islam, the position is that slavery is just not immoral. The reason that slavery fell out of favor is because of the Industrial Revolution, and basically the steam engine made slaves obsolete, because an engine can do more than 100 men or 1,000 men. So you don't really
Right.
need slaves. But if the steam engine, and actually I just had a conversation with Greg Magarshak, which I think you listened to, but
Yeah.
in that conversation he brought up like Islam and slavery. I pointed out that, well, this is in Judaism as well. But then I also pointed out that, okay, imagine that there's a huge solar flare and all the electronics, all the technology goes out the window, and we go back to a more primitive state of technology in the world. Slavery then would probably make a really big comeback, and it would be based on warfare. It would be based on all the things that I'm describing, but it's a technological aspect of history that when the industrialization happens, then you don't have slaves. Instead, you have employees. And one thing that some people point out, like Noam Chomsky, you might be familiar with, he said that historically, there's not really a distinction between employee versus slave, because the idea of an employee, like your employer is paying you and then you use that money for food and shelter. That's basically what a master does with a slave. And the only difference is that as an employee, you're like rented by your employer, but a master owns you. So it's the difference between like renting a car and owning a car. And usually when you own a car, you treat it better than a rental. So this was actually the kind of argument that the South made in American history against the North, because they said that, well, yes, we have slavery, but in the North, you have these kinds of wage slaves, and you have these factories where people are working themselves to death, whereas we treat our slaves very well because they're our property. We don't want to kill them. But with your employees in these northern factories in Boston and New York, when an employee dies, you just replace him with another body and pay him that $1 a day. Our slaves don't live in that kind of squalor. So this is
No, they were
interesting.
just whipped and sold, and their families broken up, and they didn't get to see their children anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
there was,
Employees also, employees would have
I'm
to leave their countryside to go to the big cities to work in the
sure,
factories,
but they
and they're
weren't
grinded
sold
into
off
dust.
down the river, and I mean, I understand that the work conditions can be bad, but an employee would have a choice, ideally, to go and work somewhere else, and that makes an employer want to treat their employees really well. And I think for morality reasons, I mean, I guess I can understand the argument that there might be benefits. I can understand that there's benefits to things like slavery. I still think that they're highly immoral. Just like I could see a benefit to rape, for example. I can make an argument that rape at least creates biological diversity, right? When one tribe comes in and starts raping women in another tribe and they all get pregnant, now you've at least got, you don't have a bunch of inbreds like you would have normally if the tribes just stuck to each other and were having children with each other and they're all cousins, and then cousins having children with cousins, right? I mean, I could see it like a biological benefit to rape, but it doesn't mean suddenly rape is no longer immoral. It is still highly immoral and wrong to do, even if there is a benefit that can be argued from that act. Same thing with slavery. You can argue a benefit from slavery. I understand that there's economic benefit to it. It doesn't make the act any less immoral. I also understand that all the religions have it, that it is in all the books. I don't think this is unique to Islam, just like I don't think child marriage is unique to Islam. I think these are unfair attacks on Islam. When we see a lot of people lobbying these types of attacks, saying like, well, you believe in war, you believe in child marriage, you believe in slavery. And it's like, I think that's kind of in all the books, right? All of that is in all the books. I think the difference is, though, is that if you're Orthodox Islam, I don't know if there's any Orthodox Christians or Orthodox Jews that, Orthodox Jews, I guess. I had this experience of living with these ultra Orthodox Jews at one point, don't ask. But they couldn't turn the lights on and off on Saturdays and stuff. And so I was the person that would turn the lights on and off. Like they let me commit all the sins, and they couldn't take so many steps on Saturdays. And there was a lot of restrictions there, but I still don't think they were so ultra orthodox that they would believe in these types of things in the books that are societally, we have become enlightened out of those,
Well,
like slavery and rape and
that's
child
how
marriages or whatever.
that's how the Enlightenment attacks every religion. Like the Enlightenment from, the past 200 years, they specifically start with slavery and minor marriage, and they attack those things first
Right.
and get you to compromise on those. And that's why you have Christians who will say that, oh, well, the Bible doesn't really say this, or, oh, that was fine for the past days, but it's not fine now. Or minor marriage, yeah, that's something from the past, it's not relevant today. And then the secular, like, that's the first domino, basically. And then the
But
secular
that's
says that,
true. I
well,
mean, like
if you're going to have a problem, like if you're going to amend this issue of slavery, even though it's clear in the Bible, then why don't you change your position on homosexuality? Like, why don't you change your position on theft? Like, why don't you change your position on fornication? Like, those are also in the Bible. Or the Ten Commandments. Why aren't we in different times? And therefore, you have different rules. You're willing to bend things and amend things when it came to slavery. So yeah, just apply the same principle. And that's how they get you to completely reform your entire religion and essentially abandon your religion, because you lose the principle of saying, no, we follow our traditions, we follow our scriptures. Because you've compromised and you've taken that first step, then why not take every other step? And that's why, the religion that's bleeding the most followers is Christianity in the world today.
I would argue that if you go back to the prophets, the times of the prophets, and when the prophets were giving their revelations from God, society was a certain way that God had to give his guidance and his wisdom to those societies as those societies were. If we had a prophet today that came to society today, I think that the rules and the guidance and the wisdom would be for today's time versus for the Stone Age time. I mean, I think that when God saw society and he was like, oh boy, you fools, like, let me give you some guidance. He's not going to change all of society and rewrite how they've been living and rewrite, all of their customs. He's instead going to give guidance and wisdom in that helps with the current culture and the current way of life that they're in to, like, for example, polygamy. Mormons get eviscerated for having polygamy at one point. Well, that was guidance that Mormons believe came from prophets. Prophets at that time said it's okay to take more than one wife. The reasoning, though, later when prophets then, because Mormons believe in modern day prophets, later when prophets said, okay, now you have to stop this practice, it was because at that time, when they allowed all the men to marry more than one woman, it was because there were more women converting to the church than there were men, 10 to 1. I mean, there was just a lot of women. And that was in an era where women could not work. Women could not have bank accounts. Women could not support themselves. So these women were joining the church, but then they weren't having a way to be provided for. So God then, knowing that society at that time in the 1800s, said, all right, then you can go ahead and take more than one wife. Later on, when things changed, God said, no longer, you don't need to do that anymore. Things can change because that was a morality thing that, if you believe in all of this, which I personally no longer do, but I'm just kind of giving an example that, if God sees society and says, we have a problem, this is the moral way to handle the problem. But now that problem is gone. We don't have a need to handle this problem in the most moral way. So I do think things can change based on society and based on, it's what God felt like the guidance needed to be at that time.
Well, maybe, we're in a time now where you can have transgender children. You can have 3-year-olds on hormone blockers, and you can have,
well, if God says, what are you going to do? I mean, if there's a prophet that comes down today and it is truly a prophet of God and he says, yeah, it's fine. I mean, what are you going to do?
No, but the point is that you can justify anything, like using this reasoning. You say every principle that we have, every religious principle that we have in the past is something for the past, and now we're in a different time. So that principle no longer stands. Even like Satan worship. Like maybe the idea of Satan is just a boogeyman that God had to tell us there's a boogeyman and to get us to act correctly. But Satan really is just a concept. And now we know that in our times, and we can even worship Satan. And maybe there's a prophet who's going to come and tell us that Satan worship is fine, and having child transgender drag queen story hour is fine.
I mean, Daniel, you are straw manning. You're straw manning big time. Come on.
Yeah,
devil worship.
Yeah, why
now we're
not?
going from God to
because the principle of devil worship being wrong, that's a principle that could have been for previous times, but now we're different psychologically, socially, things are very different.
That I don't
I'm
think
just using the
God.
same reasoning that you
It's
used.
that's not at all the same reasoning because that would be belief in a completely different, if you're going to believe in God, God's not going to come down and say suddenly you can believe in somebody else and go ahead and worship them. I mean that
Even the
wouldn't.
idea of God, like even the principle that there is a transcendent God, even that principle can be attacked, because you can say that, well, in previous time, people were so stupid and low IQ that you had to give them the idea of a God
I
transcendent.
believe
This is what
that.
Jordan
I
Peterson
actually do
says.
believe
Jordan
that. I
Peterson's
believe that.
that's what, so
I
that's
believe that. I
yeah.
believe that people needed like simple. I think that our brains cannot comprehend, just like going back to the very beginning of this conversation, the ability to empirically study certain concepts that are so beyond us. We don't even have the mechanisms we can't even imagine the mechanisms to empirically study these things at this point because our brains are so small. It's like trying to teach calculus to a 2-year-old. We're not there yet. We're like the 2-year-old. The truth out there is like calculus. I do think that we need simple, when a 2-year-old or 3-year-old asks me, how do you turn on the TV, how does the TV turn on, I just say press the button. I don't go into all the mechanisms of how a television works and how we end up with a picture on the screen, right? We don't describe that. We just say push the button and the TV turns on. And I think that is how humans, we've
I
needed
agree.
simple explanations.
I agree that God is beyond, what our minds can conceive. And we know certain aspects or characteristics of God, but to fully understand God is beyond our capabilities. I agree with that. But now you have people like Jordan Peterson will say, like, well, maybe God is just, whatever value that you have as your highest value. And that is a very postmodern type of understanding of God that Christians would have historically rejected and say, this is not God. God is this, the Trinity, or God is this, like a transcendent being, and he's one, and he speaks, and he, sends revelation. It's not just whatever you think of as your favorite idea or ideal. But Jordan Peterson could respond to those Christians, and he can say that, look, the idea of God as this being who speaks, that's because people in the past were just simple-minded. But now we know that actually God can be your highest ideal. So this is
Well, I don't
this is a
necessarily. I mean, I
destruction of
agree, and
Christianity.
yeah, I agree with him on the first half. I don't agree with him on the
Mhm.
second half because I think truth is truth, and it would have to be empirically, scientifically, the ability to study it and prove it at some point, whether we can in our lifetime or not, is besides that has nothing to do with whether or not something is true or real. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that we could just kind of like whatever we think is what it is. I mean, but maybe that would be an interesting. I mean, I suppose if we're going to get real philosophical, Daniel, which we could, I guess you could think that, well, like maybe there is a reality where you can think it and it manifests and that is what it is. But I don't know. But probably not. I don't know. Maybe. Daniel,
Yeah.
this has been an interesting conversation. We do have to, we could talk forever. I now know why some of your debates are like 4 hours long, why your conversations are so long. We can go on about this stuff for a long time, and you're very interesting and fascinating. And I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I say just one more thing, just
yes, of
to
course.
circle back on the point that you're asking, like, what kind of Muslim are you? And yeah, so I want to distinguish like ISIS, like the idea that Islam advocates terrorism or just killing innocent people. Like, this is contrary to Islam. Terrorism is something that I reject, and I've taught against it, spoken against it. And it's not a part of Islam. Like the most hardcore, like, I think the audience kind of gets a sense that I don't really compromise on much when it comes to Islamic teachings. If there was this kind of terroristic teaching in Islam, I would be very forthright and I'd try to give some
But there
explanation.
is
But
jihad, right?
there is jihad, but jihad is like there's defensive jihad and then there's conquest. And conquest is, again, a part of every religion, and it's a part of every philosophy and ideology. Like you were talking about American values being spread and preserving, like Americanism throughout the world, and the U.S. uses whether by hook or by crook or by carrot and the stick. America gets its way in the world and influences different factions, and sometimes the military is needed to be sent. What is the driving force of that is to spread American influence. And Islam has the same concept, like spread Islamic influence to serve the needs of God or the interests of Muslims and to serve, the higher aims of God. Like that is a part of Islamic law, and Muslims should be very honest about that. You had a different guest on the program, Hamza Yusuf, and I criticized what he was saying. He was like, "There's nothing holy about war." And I completely disagree about that. Like war and fighting for the truth, fighting for what's right, even at the cost of your own body. Like this is a very important value in Islam. It's not terrorism. It's justified military conquest through a state, through a government. And this is a value that many religions share, all religions. And it's only in the modern period where religions try to, do this Hamza Yusuf move of denying that you have militarism and conquest in your religions. It's found in Judaism and Christianity. This is why Christianity is spread throughout the world. So this is just wanted to clarify that because there's confusion. Yes, jihad is a part of Islam, but terrorism is not jihad.
And I also want to bring up something that you'd said in a previous conversation about rape on the battlefield. We've had a lot of reports about rape on October 7th, that all of these Palestinians, Hamas, they broke out and they used rape as a weapon. And I heard you say on a previous show that rape on the battlefield is not something that is actually in the Quran or in Islam.
No, there's no such thing as rape on the battlefield. I was making a distinction between the rules of war in Judaism versus Islam. Because when you go to the Talmud and you go to the authoritative rabbinical texts like the Mishnah Torah from Maimonides, there is this kind of provision for Jewish soldiers that they can rape on the battlefield, even girls as young as 3. And this is elaborated on. And even the modern rabbis in the IDF, the chief rabbi of the IDF has said that, yeah, rape is licit. You can rape as an IDF soldier. And we see, that actually happening. But in Islam, there's no such concept. There is the concept of a concubine. So again, going back to the slavery point, so slavery, women were also taken as slaves, but it was not just a one-time use them and kill them scenario. The concubine is part of the family. It's like a marriage in the sense that the concubine has rights. She's protected. She's provided for. And when she has a child, then she's freed. Those are the Islamic rules. It's a lot of details. It sounds strange if I'm just giving like a sentence or two about it, but this is something that's universally practiced, like taking concubines, because again, it's a weapon of war. You have to increase the numbers of your civilization in order to prevent being wiped out. That's why you have concubines mentioned, like Moses is telling his soldiers in the Hebrew Bible in Numbers and 1 Samuel and Deuteronomy to take the girls, the virgin girls. And that's what he's commanded in the Bible. This shows that this is something that is not specific to Islam.
Yep. Very interesting conversation, Daniel. Really appreciate you being here. Where can people find you? I'm going to put some links down below of some of the conversations that you've had, especially of some of the more controversial subjects that we've covered today. If they want to get more into your philosophy on these, or I shouldn't say your philosophy on these things, but on Islamic teaching of these things in the way that you personally interpret Islam, because that does, which I know is more orthodox to you. It seems like but I talked to 10 different Muslims and they're all saying the same thing, but you're all saying something different. So it's just like Christians, right? So Daniel, where can people find you? Where would you like people to find you?
Sure. I have a channel on YouTube. Hopefully it won't get taken down anytime soon, but it's
good luck.
Muslim Skeptic. I'm also on Rumble and on Twitter. You can find me as well. Just search my last name and muslimskeptic.com. And I just want to, say how much I appreciate, Kim, that you are willing to have this conversation, because a lot of people, they don't even want to broach these kinds of subjects, or they think it's very bizarre. And I know you don't agree with a lot of what I've said, but you can actually talk about it and, try to see things from a different perspective. I think that's a sign of really high intelligence, to be able to consider an idea or an argument without necessarily accepting it. But a lot of low IQ people, like, they don't even want to think about it. Like, it's offensive just to have the concept or the topic mentioned. So I really appreciate you for that. And I hope your audience enjoys it.
Well, thank you for saying that. Thank you so much, Daniel. We have all the links down below. Thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you.